Morguer is the Glukkon that's in charge of the bone digging operations at Necrum Mines in Oddworld Soulstorm, so naturally spoilers for that game. Out of all of the Glukkons seen in Soulstorm, I'd say Mr. Morguer is the one that interested me the most, as he showed himself to be somewhat more intelligent than the rest of them. Which adds up what with him being behind such a vital part of perhaps the Magog cartel's most important business. The Soulstorm brew industry that keeps the cartel's slave labour indentured into servitude by getting them addicted to the point of literally needing the drink in order to survive, is perhaps the only thing that prevents the enslaved Mudokkons from rising up against their oppressors. And this status quo can only be maintained if the drink is continually produced, which can't be done without one of its key ingredients, Mudokkon bones from their ancient burial ground, Necrum. And Morguer is effectively the Glukkon that's been given the responsibility of handling this part of the plan, setting up a vast mining operation, hollowing out the caves of this sacred site with massive machines, and excavating all the remains of long dead Mudokkons to be ground up and used in Soulstorm brew. How important this specific business is to the Glukkons is shown by the fact that there's an industrial guild set up dedicated to it, which Mr. Morguer is naturally a member of, holding the seal of the Grand Lodge Diggers Guild, specialising in the success of the prevalent bone industry, mining and trading this product for medicinal and commercial uses. Specifically, Morguer's rank in the guild is revealed as being the Bonesman of Necrum Mines, which is a very ominous title that shows further the far darker tone that Oddworld Inhabitants were going for with Soulstorm, especially in contrast to Morguer's Abe's Exoddus counterpart, Director Flegg, who is known as the head boner of Boneworks. The macabre nature of the Bonesman is further shown by his name, Morguer, being a play on morgue, which of course relates to burial or tombs, or is a place used for the storage of corpses. Interestingly, it would seem he was not always going to be called Morguer, or Mr. Morguer as a slig refers to him, as the 2019 book Oddworld Abe's Origins seemingly named him as Baron. For some reason the phrase Bone Baron comes to mind, but I don't know if that's an actual thing. Before that, we just knew him as Glukkon 2. Presumably this was one of the changes made during production, in much the same way Vico Depot was changed to Comet Depot and then was changed back to Vico Depot again for the final game. The insignia of the lodge reflects the grim guild, featuring a buzzard skull with a pair of pickaxes, as well as being serrated around the edges to mimic a bone saw, while a bone motif makes up various parts of the logo as well, which is proudly emblazoned on a medal that Morguer wears from his collar, in much the same way that World War II German officers wore the Iron Cross. Indeed, Oddworld Inhabitants outright stated that while the outfits of all of the Glukkons in Soulstorm were influenced by the SS, Morguer's uniform was very blatantly, in particular, heavily based on them. His attire just generally is very militaristic, but this is perhaps most exemplified by the most unique part of his outfit that sets him apart from literally every single Glukkon ever seen, that being his boots. The Oddworld Soulstorm The Art of the Video Game book explains that the Necrum Mining Company executive prefers tight business-like tailoring around his collar and jacket, but that gives way to more practical design around his legs and in his boots, which are styled to resemble work boots. Our goal was to have him appear strict and authoritarian, but also show that ultimately his business is the drilling and extraction of materials deep within the ground. Clearly, his outfit shows just how Morguer really seems to take his work seriously, although I must admit I'm not quite convinced on Glukkons wearing such a thing. When I first saw him walking about in the final cutscene, I did think it looked a bit silly, him wearing these massive boots, and it made him look really short, especially when he has to jump up that step. Actually, I think it's probably primarily due to him wearing those military jodhpurs that go like a third way up his body that makes him look kind of short. The boots boots would have worked for me, I think, if he didn't also have the jodhpurs. Interestingly, there were alternative designs for his boots, one seemingly from his heavy metal days and the other encrusted with jewels. I can't tell if this would have looked even more silly, probably yes, or whether it would have actually made sense for a Glukkon to wear such an ornate thing. In the end, from what I can tell, it looks like they went with a very simplified, just standard looking sort of boots, which was probably the right option, even if I still think work boots just don't seem like something even a Glukkon in charge of such an operation would wear, as though he were doing the work himself. But perhaps it suggests he has a more a more engaged role in the business than other Glukkons might have. Someone that really gets in there and personally inspects what's going on to ensure things are running smoothly, as opposed to someone that lounges about in an office all day. So in that respect, I guess it does make sense that he'd need the boots when going about the caves of Necrum, and also says a lot about his character and just how different Morguer is compared to his colleagues, which does really make him stand out more. A further difference between him and the standard Glukkons is his head, which includes spike-like protrusions on the underside of his cranium. I always thought he had quite a unique head for a Glukkon, but I've actually just noticed that when you look at him from behind or from the side, he does actually still maintain that very standard traditional Glukkon shaped head, even more so than some of the others actually. It's just very flat, so I guess from the front it looks really unusual. Morguer's unique appearance reflects his role as probably the smartest Glukkon in the game. Unlike the others, he doesn't believe the propaganda spewed by the news organisations that spread their hatred and lies against Moloch the Glukkon, trying to blame him for everything that's going wrong for them, Rupture Farms getting destroyed by Abe and their workforces disappearing. Instead, Morguer is skeptical, rolling his eyes at conspiracy theories and questions everything he hears.
Would Moloch really burn his own farm down? Or is the brew failing us?
And although he doesn't have enough information to fully work out what's going on, he's on the right track and is basically doing his own investigations, trying to get a hold of the brewmaster to get answers from him on his suspicions that the brew is failing to keep the Mudokons under their power, allowing them to rise up. Morguer's the sensible guy that thinks for himself and is very logical in his perceptions. He reminds me of that Imperial officer in the first Star Wars film that early on warns that the Death Star is vulnerable and whatnot. Meanwhile, you've got the other officer, or Aslick in Soulstorm.
Never in history has a Mudokon beaten a Glukkon ever.
That arrogantly argues that it's not possible for them to be defeated by their respective rebellions. Much like the other Glukkons in this game, Morguer has a really unusual accent. To me it always sounded kind of Texan, especially when he says, "Would Moloch really burn his own farm down?" I don't think that's right. Maybe it's like a mixture of German and Texan or something. I don't know. Although while editing, I realised it reminded me of something else, and I was trying to remember what it was. And then it hit me. Cad Bane, or at least how Cad Bane talks in live action. When Morguer is unable to get in contact with the brewmaster, he takes it upon himself to fly on his airship to Soulstorm Brewery to confront him in person. The part of the ending where Morguer meets Aslick outside the brewmaster's office is a great scene, I think, as again it says a lot about their respective personalities. Aslick tries to make small talk with Morguer.
Morguer, I thought the bone harvesting business was treating you well. We were fools to ever have believed in his brew.
But Morguer seems almost annoyed by this, or with his mind focused on the business at hand, and doesn't engage at all in niceties. He's a very no-nonsense and practical individual, and just gets right to it, which is mirrored in his choice for the design of his office. It's very bare bones, if you'll pardon the pun, built deep into the caves of Necrum itself, showing how he likes to be in the thick of his business. It's also very sparse, and again, very practical. It's not not very ornate, instead being very serious and quite grim, much like the Gluck himself. That being said, he does perhaps kind of show a couple of signs of weakness. Despite his almost perpetual stern appearance, he's clearly intimidated by the brewmaster. When the door to the office opens, he does, along with Aslic, briefly look terrified, although I think that says more about how powerful and respected the brewmaster is more than anything. Despite Morguer's clear determination, shown by the fact he takes the lead on confronting and even demanding compensation from such a powerful figure in Glukkon society, the brewmaster was quite quickly able to convince both him and Aslic of his version of events and lead Morguer astray from his original correct suspicions that Moloch was innocent in the destruction of Rupture Farms. Suddenly, Morguer is, much like every other Glukkon, against Moloch. Not for long though, as Moloch overhears this conversation and bribes Morguer and Aslic's slig security forces to turn on them, assassinating the three Glukkons. And I noticed that it might just be the angle, but it almost looks like Morguer tries to hide behind Aslic and use him as a shield. In the bad ending of the game, they still all die when Soulstorm Brewery is destroyed, so they're pretty unlucky really. They die no matter what happens in the game, which I think is actually a great shame. We didn't really get that much of Morguer in Oddworld Soulstorm. He's literally only present in 2 cutscenes, and honestly I think he, along with Aslic, should have had a more important role. I thought he was a great and really interesting character. I feel like there was kind of no point to them being in the game, as they don't really play much of a part in the story. I think you could take them out of the game entirely, which would be incredibly easy to do, literally just remove their respective cutscenes and take them out of the ending cutscene, and the game, nor even the story of the game, would change at all. This is contrasted by their equivalents in Abe's Exoddus, where you really couldn't do that. They're a fundamental part of that game, if that makes sense. I think Morguer's lack of screen time would have been fine if he remained alive at the end of the game, so they could have used him in future installments as a recurring antagonist after witnessing the events of Soulstorm. So I find it unfortunate that such an interesting character was killed off after having such an insignificant role. And that's a compliment. They built him up really well. It felt like they were setting something up. I was really curious to see how all these different Glukkons with their different opinions would interact and what would come of that, how they'd clash and have different takes on the situation and whatnot. So I definitely would have liked to have seen more of Morguer.
Hello, follow me.